Hello, Srini. Thanks for being on the show today. We have Srini Rao, who is many things, including an entrepreneur and a podcast host. So it feels a little strange interviewing you when I've heard you interview so many other people, but I'm glad you're here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We'll jump into our icebreaker question, which is, what is your favorite superpower?
My favorite superpower of mine or anybody's?
The question is very open. Okay. So,
well, if I could have a superpower, it would probably be to fly. Yeah. That would be the one I would choose.
What's the reason?
To be able to go anywhere I wanted to go.
Yeah, like instantly, right? Yeah. I saw you said that you wanted to be Superman when you were little.
I did.
Thought that was really cute.
A fantasy that never was realized.
Maybe it will. What?
Well, I had the Superman pajamas.
Yeah, there you go.
That's the closest I got to Superman.
There you go. What is the favorite superpower that you have, since you asked that?
I think my greatest superpower is probably that I can put anybody behind a microphone and make them sound interesting.
Yeah, I think that's very true for you. So you have your own show. I've enjoyed listening to your podcast. It's called the Unmistakable Creative Podcast. And I'd love to start off hearing about the background for your podcast. I'm really curious what made you choose the name Unmistakable Creative. I've heard you say a little bit about it, but I want to hear it for our audience. And so why'd you just decide to make your own podcast? What's the story behind the album cover? All of that stuff. Just give us some background.
I mean, me ending up here is largely accidental. It wasn't really planned. I graduated business school April 2009. It was a terrible time to get out of school, as you probably know, since you work at a business school. I'd imagine your students here probably felt that same pain. It was just not a good time to be getting out of a graduate program because nobody was hiring. The economy was in a tailspin. And I didn't actually intend to start a podcast. I started a blog. And one of the first things that I enrolled in this course, and the 13th lesson in that course was to interview somebody as a way to get traffic to your website. So I didn't just interview one person. I just created a weekly series called Interviews with Up-and-Coming Bloggers. And the 13th guy I interviewed basically said, I think you're a much better interviewer than you are a writer. So I think you should take the interview series and spin it out into a separate site because I think you'll be far more successful that way. And so in an hour, I mocked up the first version of the site, sent it back to him, and I said, is this what you had in mind? And it was a terrible looking site. It was called Blogcast FM. And I think he was stunned that I was as quick to act as I did, but I was like, I think this is what I'll call it. I'll buy the domain. And I was like, great, when do you want to get started? I don't think he intended to be a business partner, but he saw that, wait a minute, like this guy isn't going to screw around. He's serious. So that's how it started. It was largely an accidental start. So I basically, it was kind of neat because I was building my own blog, and at the same time I was interviewing all these successful bloggers. So I was learning all these things about publishing and but what ended up happening is, I think probably 2-3 years. And so we started podcast, 2009 was the first iteration of it, was Interviews Up-and-Coming Bloggers. In 2010, we launched it as Blogcast FM. By 2013, one thing was really becoming clear to me, that I didn't care at all about how people grew traffic to their blogs. And I thought it was really mind-numbing to talk to them about online marketing and all sorts of stuff. And it wasn't just mind-numbing to me. I realized that our most popular episodes had nothing to do with that. They were people who had really crazy stories, who happened to have blogs. Like this woman who had, spent a few years in prison, believe it or not, here in Bryan, which is a whole other story. But and I remember thinking, I was like, these are the stories that are really fascinating. These are the stories that are striking a chord with our listeners. And I think the ultimate litmus test was a friend of mine who had nothing to do with the world of blogging. And he said, I like your interviews when they're not about any of this stuff. And I was like, okay, this is much more a real litmus test, because the problem is, like, you're in this bubble of other bloggers. It's like, yeah, of course they like it because it's relevant to them, but it wasn't relevant to a larger group of people. And so what ended up happening was I had this mentor come along in 2013. And basically one of the things he said is, like, we should gut the whole brand and rebrand it. And so at the same time that happened, I had a book come out called The Art of Being Unmistakable. And, through a series of freakish coincidences, I landed myself on the Glenn Beck show. And so anyways, we went through, 100 different names. Every day he would send me a name and I'm like, no, that's terrible. I'm like, we're not going to name it that. I'm finicky when it comes to certain things. Like, I'm very particular. I was like, no. I mean, he must have sent me, I think it just, and then the moment he said Unmistakable Creative, we're like, that's it. He said, great, go buy the domain now. And that's how the name came about. As far as the artwork and the album cover, so the brand sort of just, it kind of organically developed into what it is. So one of the things that happened as a byproduct of even the first podcast was that I just met a lot of people and a lot of creative people. And there was a girl who was one of our listeners who was a cartoonist. And so one day I went to her and I said, hey, and she was a big fan. Unfortunately, we ended up parting ways, not on the best of terms, but so I went to her and I said, hey, I'm getting kind of bored of just using people's headshots. I was like, do you want to do an illustration? I thought it might be neat. And she said, yeah. And I kind of thought she'd just draw like a little cartoon sketch. And what she came back with was the album cover. And we were like, okay. And so when we gutted the first brand, we're like, okay, that's it. Every album cover is every interview is gonna have an album cover. And not only that, we had another friend design the logo. So you see that logo at the bottom of every album cover. And the idea was that every time something that we did rolls through your Facebook newsfeed, there's no question as to who it came from.
Right.
It was from us. And that just kind of became the signature of the brand, almost entirely by accident.
Yeah, it's definitely very distinct. I love how much of your story was unplanned, as many are, right? And I know you did a lot of surfing after you graduated from business school. Yeah, it does take a lot of time and energy. Cost me money. Right. It is a nice, pretty
it's
free
a perfect
sport.
Hobby for an unemployed person.
That's true. But how much of your story was unplanned? And even I think I've heard you say the going from blogging to podcast was partially a matter of efficiency too. You could churn out more interviews than you could blogs to an extent.
I mean, even writing, I can churn it out regularly. And, part of it is kind of finding that balance of, okay, how much do you produce in volume and then where do you find quality? Like, I think we do 2 interviews a week now. And to me, it was just like, I'm not going to do a daily show. That's just insane.
Right.
I think I would lose the quality. And plus the way I do my interviews, I couldn't do it daily. I would go and that would just be draining because it takes work.
Yes, as we've learned here, it takes a lot of work. It's not just an iPhone and put it out there, right? It is a lot of work. You just mentioned the balance between productivity or volume and quality or even creativity. And you've said before that in order for someone to be creative, they really need to produce a lot of volume.
Yeah.
And that can be really hard for a lot of creative people in the world.
Yeah.
I know some of the most creative people I have in my life are perfectionists. I am not a perfectionist. I am totally fine with good enough is good enough and let's get it done. Yeah. I'm also not the most creative person I know. So I think that is a tricky balance. I know the Da Vinci quote is, art is never finished, only abandoned. Yeah. So when you talk to people, how do you talk to them about that, striking that balance between productivity and creativity? So
when it comes to my writing, the thing that's easy is I can do so much of the writing in private, right? And I think that we forget that, a good amount of the seeds for your most resonant public work are often planted in private. Like most of the work of a creative person happens out of view of an audience, particularly writing. And so to me, the way you overcome that is with volume. Like I always have. Like I always say, I'm not a great writer. I just write a lot. So that happens to, and some of it happens to be decent. And as far as interviews go, I've gotten better with time. I mean, I've made it a point to go back and review my work. And now it's just, I have a standard. And if that standard isn't met, I will cut the interview in the middle of it. I will scrap it or I won't air it. And you know what? I've pissed some people off. And then I've had others who will go and do what I tell them to and say, okay, let me go listen to another episode. And they'll come back and we'll knock it out of the park. And I'm like, you know what? The attention of your listeners is a precious commodity. Like they have so many other options. If you put something really terrible out, they're going to make decisions. Like if this is somebody who's listening to this for the first time and they're hearing this, I'm not willing to take that chance. So it's a balancing act. But I think that, one of the things that's interesting is that I think the biggest fear that people have is that their work isn't going to be good. And, I was just talking to the class about this and I said, look, your work isn't going to be good when you start.
Right.
That's just the reality of it, and you're never going to know how to get better unless you put it out.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's so important. There's a software for writing. You may have used it before where if you don't keep writing, it'll start deleting your work. And it is really important. Like just get it out of your head and on paper, and then you can make it great, right? You have to give yourself permission to write something really crappy. And you're probably not going to. I mean, you might write something.
Well, I think, Anne Lamott, the writer, says that all good writing begins with terrible first efforts. And it's true.
Yeah, absolutely. You can't get to the second effort without the first one.
Yeah.
Your first question on your show to your guests is often, what did your parents do and how did that impact you in your work?
Yeah.
I want to ask you the same question.
It's funny, I think, for my parents. I mean, my dad worked here at Texas A&M.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's why we lived here for 7 years. So, And so my dad's an academic, and I think I saw firsthand, in a lot of ways, I think my parents influenced me by me showing me what I didn't want to do with my life. I kind of saw that, okay, this isn't all that interesting to me. I didn't want to be a doctor, even though Indian parents want all their kids to be doctors. And it was, one of those things where I'll tell you, they're good and bad things, right? So as far as putting me down this path, my parents probably would have discouraged it. And they did early on. Like, I was going to be a music major. You're from Texas, so this is like a breeding ground for professional musicians. Like, they're the best high school music programs in the country.
Yes.
And that was incredibly informative. And it's still, to this day, that is what I say has been the foundation for me as a creative person, was what I learned here. But they were very clear that they're like, this is a bad idea for you to go and be a music major. And they were right. I played the tuba. Like, you have to wait for somebody to die for a job to open up. Mm-hmm. And so that was like a non-option.
There aren't a lot of tuba jobs out there? What?
No.
Yeah.
So anyways, I kind of, followed the sort of conventional path of get an MBA, get an economics degree, go and try to do the whole corporate thing. And it didn't work. I wasn't good at it. And so when I went down this path, I think, there's always a sort of cultural conflict that you have. But I think the one thing that my parents did instill in me that I think served me extremely well was discipline. And I still have that discipline to this day. Like, I write 1,000 words every morning, and I've done that for, I think, 7 years now. And that's, been life-changing. And so I think in that sense, that is one of the biggest things they gave to me, was discipline. And I think the other thing that, when you come from this place where you have a conflict with your culture, it's endless amounts of material to write about. So there's never any shortage of material for somebody like me.
And the conflict with your culture being that you didn't follow the path that your parents would have wanted for you.
Yeah.
You asked one of your guests a question about higher education, which made me wonder what your view is on higher education. So, and then knowing that your dad was an academic, what are your views on higher education?
I remember seeing that question. I was glad you asked it. And I always ask it because I feel in so many ways that I'm a failed byproduct of the education system. Look, I did what you're supposed to do. I went to one of the most elite schools in the country as an undergrad. I got an MBA from, I think, what is a very second-tier school. Like, I wouldn't hire most of my classmates to mow my lawn at my parents' house.
Well, that's a nice compliment.
Yeah, but I honestly, after going, to go from a place like Berkeley to that, it was a real contrast to see. It was just kind of, wow, this is. I think my biggest issues, I think these are my criticisms. Look, I think there's value to education. It's not that I don't think there's value to education, but I think that in this country, education is a business. It's not a service. We don't treat it like a public service. And in any other business, if you sold your customers products that led to this kind of outcome, you wouldn't have any customers. I think that it's overpriced. I think that it doesn't lead to its intended outcomes, and I think it's outdated. I think that it's in need of a serious reboot. It's like I said, I think teachers have been some of the most invaluable people in my life, and it's not that I think there's no value to education, but I think it's in need of a serious update, and it doesn't seem like that's happened. I think that, I was extremely frustrated with the administration at my business school program because I felt that they just did not take the concerns of the students seriously. It was more about rankings and all sorts of stuff. And it was like, okay, you have a guy in your career office who's telling Indian students to change their names to get hired. I'm like, this is really bad. The fact that you would let this happen for a year with my tuition dollars, I'm sorry, that really upset me. Yeah. I just think we're in a phase where it needs to change. It's outdated. That's the biggest issue with it. And there's not enough practical application. So, my joke is always, I said that, going to business school doesn't teach you anything about running a business. It teaches you how to be an employee in somebody else's. So, if you put most people out on the street after an MBA and said, hey, here's 150 grand, start a business, most of them will run that business into the ground within a year because the reality is they don't know anything about running a business.
Right. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. If I were, I actually don't disagree with some of the things that you said. I hope that at Texas A&M, we're not doing a lot of the things that you mentioned. Like, we're not chasing rankings. We're really trying to have good outcomes for our students. But we talk a lot about on this show about how education is kind of a mass product, a product for the masses and not for each individual.
And it should be.
And it should be, but that is really hard to do. I think if I were starting a business school from scratch, even undergrad or grad, it would be that application that every day you're doing something for a business and we're figuring out what you need to know to do it.
So did you ever see the movie Accepted with Justin Long? Okay.
No.
So really funny movie. Basically, this kid doesn't get into college. And so what he does is he makes up a fictional college just to appease his parents, and he puts a website up and basically prints a fake acceptance letter. But on accident, one of his friends makes the website functional. And then, he has to basically tell his parents that he's going somewhere. And so he makes up a college. They go and they rent a building in town. And then he opens the door on the first day, and there's like 1,000 people there who apparently apply to the college. And they've paid tuition as well.
Wow.
And he doesn't know what to do with it. And so, he basically hires Lewis Black as the dean. It's a really funny movie, but he says, well, what are we supposed to teach them? He said, well, I don't know. Why don't you ask them? And basically what they do is they just ask students, what do you want to learn about? And it's kind of amazing that we would never think to do that, hey, to me, I think if any educational institution has the courage to do that, even for a year, I think it could be one of the most transformative things they would do, is to bring a group of students in and say, hey, we're starting an experimental program in which you guys are going to design the curriculum, not us. Because what you do as, educational institutions, and this is not a criticism of you guys, it's just the reality of, this is life in general, is we treat education like a fast food menu. People are just taught to choose from the options that have been put in front of them. Nobody ever says, well, what if these options don't work for you? What if you don't find any of this interesting? What if you don't want to do any of these things? And that to me has always been really strange. It's like you said, it's a one size fits all solution. And you're right, it is hard to customize it. And at the same time, I think if an institution had the courage to say, you know what, we're going to take it was funny because in that movie, they would ask somebody, one guy was like, what do you want to learn about? He's like, well, I want to learn about food. He's like, great, appropriate all of this guy's tuition dollars towards the culinary arts, bring in chefs to teach him, do whatever. Think about it. If you had a business school student said, you know what, I want to open a restaurant. Great. Then that's precisely what you should allocate his tuition dollars towards.
And now there is a lot of education that can take place online that can be customized. To me, I think, and this is not my original idea, there was a guy named Jose Bowen from Texas Lutheran University who said if a brick and mortar institution wants to differentiate themselves from an online institution, it needs to be in the people. And what you talked about, where teachers, professors were some of the most impactful people in your lives, that's what education does well. Yeah, and should be. And it exposes you to things, so you talk about the restaurant student. My only counter to that would be, great, take a bunch of classes on how to start a restaurant, but also take a sociology class, right? Because you need to know how people work and how the world works.
And I think that's one thing, unfortunately, you're losing in this generation of people who are just connected to devices is that this sort of, social intelligence is being, lost day by day because we spend more time interacting with people through screens than we do face to face. And that's a whole other landmine of a discussion.
Right. Which we've kind of had before. So we don't have to go down that path, but it is true. And it'll be interesting to see how that really changes the world. You talk a lot on your show about the hero's journey, which is a common story format. And you can probably explain it better than I can, but I may let you do that. But you've also talked about how the last year has been really challenging for you. And I'm just wondering, what's been your kind of crucible moment as part of that hero's journey? Are you in it right now? Is it something you experienced before?
No, I think I'm kind of, I think I'm at a high point right now, which has been really nice. My sister just got married, had made a lot more money in this last 3 months. It's funny because I think that we have this idea that it's just, smooth sailing and you're, on this rocket rhythm, and once you reach the peak, nothing changes. But the reality is that your standards change and what you want changes. And, I think the crucible is a normal part of this for everybody. There's, people who you look at and they look like they have it completely together. And then you come to find out that wait a minute, this was the worst year of their life. Really? I would have never guessed that. One of my friends actually said that, in a blog post. And I remember because I interviewed her live in person, and she has a massive online following. And I would have never guessed that from having that conversation. But I've had a few. There are moments when you kind of look at the runway in your business and you're like, okay, wait a minute, we got to figure out how we're going to make more money, or we're going to be at it. We're going to be done here soon. And that happens. It's just kind of reality, but you hope what really happens is you come out of it and you learn from it and you become stronger for it. And, you kind of apply the lessons from it to whatever you do next. So no, I'm not really in one right now. I've had them. In 2014 when I was close, we were really literally on the verge of running this thing into the ground. It was bad. And luckily a friend came along and really helped me turn things around. And I think that, people always say, like, you realize, in my mind, when you're going through the worst of times, that's when you find out who your real friends are.
Absolutely. And I think what you said is important about, we don't know when it's the worst year of someone's life. Yeah. I mean, it can, because we live a very curated life. I mean, even if you take social media aside, we still live a very curated life. I don't know what everyone in this hallway is feeling and experiencing outside of work all the time. Some of them they may tell me, but they may not. And and then you add social media on top of that, where you really can curate your life so much. It's hard to tell what people are going through, even the people we sometimes admire the most. So you don't consider yourself a naturally positive person, or I've read you where you said that. Yeah. And instead you use scientific ways to achieve happiness. What are some of those surprising life hacks for happiness that you've implemented? Well,
I think that I tend to be skeptical about anything that I can't explain to a fault. Like, to me, it's kind of like, okay, if I can't back this up by research, it's just a bunch of new age BS. Even though I went and saw an energy healer last year, and there are things that like that you can't explain. But I think a couple of them that come to mind, one is something very simple that it's not, anything that I can't even take credit for, is the idea of a gratitude practice. And that I think sleep and exercise are really big ones, and those are things that we sacrifice significantly today in a way that we never have before. Like, our sleep is terrible because we're spending so much time on our devices, but exercise, I mean, like sleep, exercise, and gratitude, like those three things alone could just be transformative for somebody in terms of just changing their baseline level of happiness.
Gratitude seems to be a continuing theme on our show. That's a lot of our that's my advice to our listeners. It's a lot of our guests' advice. If we had one impact on people, it would be that they would implement a gratitude practice, or I would hope that that's what our impact would be. And it doesn't
take, I mean, for how little time it takes, the payoff is so big.
It is. And it's so easy. People say like, oh, first world problems or whatever, but it is really easy to get into that. Oh, my life is so hard. My job is not as flexible as I want it to be.
Things that we complain about on a daily basis that for most people would be, it's like, oh, I'm stuck in traffic in College Station and it's taking me 5 minutes longer to get where I want to go than I thought it was going to. And like, this is a big catastrophe. And it's like, yeah, somebody in the world is starving. This isn't that big. And I'm not saying I'm immune to that. I complain about traffic all the time. I live in Southern California. So, but yeah, here you don't even expect to sit in traffic. And when it happens, you're like, oh. I mean, like the smallest things.
Yeah. But you have a car. I mean, there's so much to be grateful for, even in that moment of being stuck in traffic. Like, I have somewhere to be, that I'm annoyed that I'm stuck in traffic, right? Yeah. I mean, all of those things, there's something behind that to be grateful for. It's just not how we frame things.
Right.
What makes you brave and what makes you scared?
I think what makes me brave is probably expressing my creativity. Like, I think that's just always been. So as far as what makes me scared, I think that there's something that became very apparent to me in the last year, and that was just that the time we have left with the people who are closest to us is incredibly limited. Like, and you kind of start to see that in a very visceral way as you get older. Like, wow, you're watching your parents' age, and you're like, hey, they're not going to always be here. And I think it hits even harder when I come to a place like this after 25 years to think that, wow, 25 years has gone by. And in a lot of ways, for me, I left here, right after my freshman year of high school. So in a lot of ways, this place is more home than Riverside ever will be. Mm-hmm. The thing that makes home a Riverside home is my parents. But it just makes you, I was with my friend last night and we were talking, and his dad had passed away in 8th grade. And so you kind of see that. I think like that realization probably is the thing that makes me scared the most.
I agree. It's too easy to get wrapped up in that treadmill of life, right? And not take those moments to enjoy the process and the people that are around you. One of the things that you talk about a lot on your show is really finding your purpose in life, which seems important if we think about life being finite.
Yeah.
And Simon Sinek actually, I believe, said to you, your why lives in inspiring and helping people to find that one thing that inspires them and makes them stand out from everybody else. And first, I want Simon Sinek to tell me my purpose in life. Like, that would be really cool. That sounds amazing.
Yeah. Well, that was why I was like, well, dude, I got Simon Sinek here. I'm like, it's time. And it's really funny you say that, because if you look at the core, message behind everything I do, it stands in that idea of what is it that makes you distinctive. That's like the entire ethos of Unmistakable, because he's like, you're obsessed with people who are good at unusual things. That's your why. And I thought about it. And I'm like, I want to talk to a guy who robbed 30 banks. That's being good at something unusual, you know? It's a weird thing. And the thing is that, it's funny because, it makes me think, like, if I were to redesign the curriculum at a business school, I think we're missing a lot of these fundamental parts. Like, we don't actually really spend a lot of time in our business schools talking about values and character and things that make a really meaningful difference. You don't think about these. Like, I remember, when I was in business school, everything was about how good is this going to look on my resume and how much does it pay? Never does this fulfill some deeper need? And I remember I had this organizational behavior class and I hated that class. And now I look back and I realize, like, oh, that was probably one of the most important classes I took because of the fact that you were learning all these foundational things there. And I don't think we spend nearly enough time. Part of it is that also you have to go through life experiences to kind of come to a lot of these realizations, right? Like, you could have told me a lot of this when I was 20. I would have been like, yeah, whatever.
Right.
Yeah. But I think that, if I were to really truly sit down and to redesign an MBA program from scratch, I would put this kind of stuff into the curriculum. I would say, look, you really should think about what is it that you find truly engaging, not just what looks great on a resume, because the thing that looks great on a resume might be the job that you hate, and that we don't think about that at all.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, in my mind, I would literally create the curriculum from the ground up and I would rewire it based on what I've learned from 700 interviews. Like, if somebody will ever let me do that at an institution, I don't know if anybody will be crazy enough to let me do that.
I'm happy to start an institution with you. We could do that together. It could be the next venture, but I don't know that an existing institution would be able to really overhaul in that way, right?
Well,
it's
and that's
hard
the thing,
to
right?
move the
Is
ship.
that you're talking about significant cultural change. Somebody was asking me about, why is it that organizations don't change? And, I know because I go up, they get paid to go in organizations. I'm like, thanks for your gigantic check. I'm sure nothing is going to change based on me being here, which is frustrating because you hope that you'll be there and something will change as a result of it. And at the same time, what you're trying to do is just change legacy institutions and legacy behavior. But I think that, to me, even if you were to start it here, it would be fine. Take a small subset of students and run an experimental program on them who would be open to it. I think you have to start somewhere because you can sit here and we can say, okay, yes, there's, administration and deans and, paperwork and all this stuff that stands in your way. Or you can say, you know what, let's take 5 students because the risk of doing that is not that high. Yeah. We'll put them through our regular curriculum, but we'll layer this on top of it.
Yeah.
I think education is due for a change, but the challenge is, of course, that the people within the system themselves have no incentive to change. I know because my dad's a tenured professor. Like, it's a good gig if you're a tenured professor. Why would you want to change the system?
Right. When it works for you or it's the most efficient, right?
Yeah.
Like, sometimes we often in life opt for the most efficient. Yeah. And I think in higher education, sometimes we do too. What is the most unexpected experience you've had inspiring other people or helping them to stand out and be unmistakable?
I think the unexpected experiences are what people have done with the unmistakable content that really kind of just shocks you. I mean, you get stories like I have parents who homeschool their children using our content with therapists who counsel their patients. You'll get stories where people say, thanks to the unmistakable creative, I've like put an end to addiction to something and was dealing with like bulimia, and you're just like, whoa, okay. I like, these are problems that I'm not anywhere near qualified to solve. Sure. Like, if anybody personally tries to email me and tells me these problems, like, because I opened up a coaching practice to do one-on-one work with people. And I pretty much made it clear. I was like, I'm not a life coach. And if you've got problems that are in that nature, I was like, you should see a therapist. I can't help you with this. Like, I can help you write a book. I can help you do that. So I was like, I'm dealing with some of these problems myself. But I think that's been really one of the neat things to see is the sort of unexpected outcomes. And that's part of the reason we've held this line of, we're not going to teach tactics. We're going to tell stories because we see that this is an impact that you can't really put a price and you can't quantify that in any way, and that is a beautiful thing.
I like that. Not teaching tactics, but telling stories. Absolutely important. What have you found to be the most impactful way for you to practice and grow your creativity?
I would say my daily writing habit. I think that's the sort of foundation on which everything else is built. Like, everything I do really stems from that. It's where I get my ideas for books. It's where I think about podcast guests. It's where I think about creative projects. Like, I can trace everything back to that. It's one of those things where it says second nature at this point is brushing my teeth. It's what I do when I wake up in the morning. Yeah. Like, I read a book and I write, and I do that every day. And I'll do that for the rest of my life. I've jokingly said there's only 2 good reasons to skip that: sex or surfing. And those are good reasons.
And I assume that you do that in the morning
Yeah.
intentionally. That's the first thing that you do in the day.
Yeah. I think that is, you look at sort of creative people, you look at successful people. Chase Jarvis, who runs Creative Live, he'd asked me, he said, you've interviewed so many people, patterns, what are they? And I said, well, I think the one common one between everybody I've spoken to is they're incredibly deliberate about every aspect of their life, from where they live to the way their environments are set up to what they wear to who they surround themselves with. And for the most part, we don't make deliberate choices about this. Like, we're just kind of default responding. Like, and I think consuming content is a perfect example of that. Most of us just scroll through our newsfeed and click on whatever strikes our fancy, or open up a website. Whereas if you're like, okay, I'm going to deliberately choose what I want to consume, it's I think a much more smart, intelligent way to go about how you consume. But I mean, deliberate choices are a big part of it.
Absolutely. Your latest book, I think it was your latest, there may be one that came out more recently, but An Audience of One, was about being creative for yourself and not really worrying about what other people will like. This argument is pretty counter to a lot of what we do, a lot of what we teach in business school, even like you've been talking about. We talk about target markets and value creation and what are you going to do for your customer? And you're really saying, create this for yourself. Yeah.
Well, so the thing is that we have this idea in our head that, okay, we're going to go in and create this thing for this market of people that, is big, or we're going to chase this trend. And I think part of what's driven this is that I've seen what happens when people chase trend or try to mimic something that works. They just become pale imitations of something that already exists, which was largely the message of my previous book. My joke is that book could have also been titled Everybody is Full. Although I don't think as many people would have bought it, or they might have.
I might have. I don't know. That might have been a pretty catchy title.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know if Penguin would have been like, yeah, we'll put our name on that. But that's effectively what I said in just a very sophisticated way. Because I just saw this pattern over and over again of just endless amounts of mimicry and nobody getting a result by mimicking like somebody who was successful. Audience of One was accidental in terms of a title and an idea, because we came up with the title after I finished writing the book. But I saw it over and over, like in the research for it, that if you looked at a lot of these very successful people, sort of cultural icons, more often than not, they were either solving problems that mattered to them. Like if you look at any company, most people are solving a personal problem. Like the founders of Airbnb didn't set out to solve Airbnb. They were trying to figure out how to pay rent for the month. And that's what they figured out was, we'll just put an air mattress on our floor, and charge people to stay there and make them breakfast in the morning. And they made rent. And who would have guessed, that's what it would be. And so in a lot of ways, they were catering to an audience of one. They weren't catering to an audience of millions. Nobody knew there was an audience of billions. And the thing is that if you are trying to chase a trend, you hit what is inevitably going to be a rough patch, which you will. It's not like any of these journeys are smooth sailing. It's going to be really hard to keep going if this isn't something that matters to you or something that you find deeply fulfilling. And I think when you show up to create for an audience of one, your work takes on a very different feel. Like it's much more genuine and authentic. It's real. You can tell when somebody is writing something or creating something. You think about like musical hits, right? You can tell when they're made for the sort of mass market. It's like,
the formula.
Yeah. Like, and we all know the formula exists, but here's the thing. The formula might make somebody relevant for a moment in time. It's very rare that a formula leads to something that is timeless. Like if you think about it, Justin Bieber is popular for moments in time, but then you go and you look at people like Bob Dylan, people like U2. Their songs, U2 is a band that has spanned 4 decades of cultural relevance. Like that says something, that really, and there is no formula. And you know what? They've created albums that suck. Discotheque was a terrible album. Let's be honest. Like most of us were like, why the hell did you guys do this? I only know because I went to the concert for that.
Congratulations. Yeah.
I was like, thank God you guys went back to what you were doing before. Because that was a lousy album. But the thing is that, here we are 10, 15 years later and Bono is still relevant in culture. And you can't really say that about a Justin Bieber song from 15 years ago. Right. The formula works if you want to just sell records. But if you really want to have something that matters, that's going to be culturally relevant long after you're gone, and then, I think the formula of the mass market is not necessarily the best way to do things. And like I said, even if you look at some of the most iconic startups, most of these people weren't trying to reach an audience of billions. They were trying to solve their own problem.
Yeah. And something that you do a really good job of differentiating on your show is the difference between a hobby and a business.
Yeah.
And I think when you get into that audience of one conversation, there are audience of one hobbies that aren't going to sell and aren't going to be commercially viable. And that's okay.
That is, well, and the thing is, I think that part of what we've lost as a byproduct of social media is that we really, like, one of my friends said, is like, people don't have hobbies anymore. They just don't. Like, every time if you create art, you have to put it on Instagram for the world to see. It's
or Etsy to sell or whatever.
There's no such thing as, oh, I do this thing purely for the joy of it. And I think that's sad. I think that's really sad that we've lost that. If everything you do needs to lead to some sort of a result, like, what kind of world is that? And, I mean, think about how much we're missing out on. Like, people basically say, okay, you know what? And then you go and you look at the things that have been commercially successful. And I wrote about some of these in the book as well, like Post Secret by Frank Warren, and all these like Wild Are Humans of New York. None of these people set out thinking, oh, I'm doing this thing because it's going to allow me to build this audience of millions of people. They just did it because this sounds interesting. Like, I mean, most people don't know. The Post Secret story, Frank Warren literally just had a weird dream one night, handed out 3,000 self-addressed stamped postcards on the streets of Washington, D.C., and all it said was share an anonymous secret. And he had no idea how viral that would go. And, now, I mean, Post Secret literally has a museum exhibit in San Diego with people's secrets, and people tell him all sorts of stuff. It's kind of crazy. But I think if he had started out with the intention of, oh, I need to make this thing commercially successful, it would have been a failure right from the start. And so that's the big problem without this audience of one idea, is that if you don't have that, then there are a lot of things that would never start, and a lot of people don't start because of that, which I think is really sad.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really good advice. You close your show by asking each guest what makes someone unmistakable.
Yeah.
I've seen you answer it in a couple of different places, but I want to hear your answer and what you think makes people unmistakable.
Well, it's funny because, like, I've asked it to 100 people. I wrote a book about this, and I remember I was like, I hate this word. Like, now, but when you get done writing a book about it, because literally every question, when you're writing a book, the editor is like, okay, explain to me how this relates to the concept of being unmistakable. You're like, whoever came up with this book title is an idiot. Like, we're done. The thing I think what it is that in each of us, right, there is something that makes us very distinctive and, causes us to stand out. People always ask me, how do I choose the guests on the Unmistakable Creative? And it's never based on how famous they are. It's never based on accolades. Like, when I go through the bios of people who pitch, I'm always looking for something really strange, like something that just catches your attention. So I think that in my mind, the way I define unmistakable, I think my friend Mars Dorian, who does a lot of our artwork, to me, he's the dictionary definition of unmistakable, that his work is so distinctive that literally you can take one look at it and you're like, yeah, he's the one who did it. You don't have to put your name on it, like no signature required. And I think there are certain people who have that. Like, you can hear a U2 song and you're like, oh, that's a U2 song. Or, A.R. Rahman is this Indian composer who does all the films for Bollywood films. And he's like more famous than Madonna and Britney Spears, like sold millions of albums. You can listen to one movie in any of his movies and you're like, A.R. Rahman had to have done the soundtrack for this. Like, he did the soundtrack for Slumdog and a bunch of other stuff. And you can listen to it and you're like, yeah, that absolutely has his signature. It's unmistakable. So that to me is what it is.
Yeah. You talk a little bit about that inner child being part of what makes you unmistakable. And one of the pieces of advice you give is like, just get a box of crayons and start, just figuring out projects. And one of the most impactful things that I did when I was doing my PhD was an exercise called Possible Selves. And you draw with crayons. Where do you want to be in 5 years? Who do you want to be in 5 years? And I thought that was really cool advice to just kind of get out of, everything feels so serious. You're writing a business plan, right? And it's, 50 pages later. And if we just took some crayons and wrote it out.
Well, I mean, you think about it, right? Like by default, if you're doing a business plan, you're typing on a computer, by default, your brain is linked to, okay, this is adult behavior. If you take out a box of crayons, your brain links, oh, this is what it was like to be a kid. So you're kind of, you don't have the sort of boundaries that are imagined that you have when you're kind of acting like an adult. And so I think that's really kind of a powerful thing.
Yeah, that's really cool. So let's move into our rapid fire questions, which is a segment on our show. What do you consider your most valuable failure?
I think almost running Unmistakable Creative into the ground was by far the most valuable failure because, well, that and then getting rejected from every business school I applied to.
Yeah, because it put you on a totally different path.
I mean, it completely changed the entire trajectory of my life to not go, like if I had ended up at NYU Stern or any of these places that I wanted to go to, who knows, I would be sitting in an office today somewhere.
Yeah.
So I think those.
Was there one thing about the almost running Unmistakable into the ground that you were doing that you were able to change?
I think that this is a tough one for everybody, right? I realize that like my personal life is going to have things that go wrong, whether that be breakups, whether that be all sorts of stuff. And at a certain point, I realized, okay, there's got to be some separation between these two things because, I had a mentor. He's like, dude, you're a public figure with a massive presence. Like you need to get together. You don't get to act like a lunatic when you have a public presence. Like you really don't have the luxury of a public meltdown, no matter how much difficult stuff you're going through.
Right.
And that was an important lesson. It was a lesson in maturity because you realize you're like, and now I'm in a situation where I have, speaking agents, editors, publishers, like all of my behavior doesn't just affect me anymore. There's a number of people who bet their careers on my ability to do what I say I'm going to do and behave in a way that is expected. And at the same time, also have this, sort of rebel, unmistakable tendency. So I think it was, to me, it was a lesson in maturity probably that came from that.
Yeah. What do you think is people's biggest misconception of you?
That I have everything completely together and that, I'm on my game all the time, probably.
Yeah. And you don't have to be, right?
No.
That's not, it shouldn't be an expectation.
Well, and that's the thing, right? So misconceptions are easy to form when you have a public presence, because what happens when you have a public presence is that no matter how authentic you claim to be, look, you and I are going to have a conversation. There are things that I will say in front of my closest friends and family members that I would never say behind this microphone.
Fair.
I just wouldn't, because, it would be completely inappropriate. Like I have no filters when I talk to close friends. I'll say incredibly politically incorrect things, but I'm also mindful of the fact that, wait a minute, 1,000 people hear me say that. It's a different story. Like I'll give you an example. I had a female friend who hosts a podcast, and her first question is, what do you like most about being a man? Which is a loaded question. And so I gave this answer, and I'm not going to repeat it here because I'm, enough that, and then I went and explained it to two of my business partners, and they're like, we know you well enough to know that it couldn't have come out anywhere near as nicely as you're saying. You recorded it, right? Play it back for us. So I did. And they're like, dude, this is a PR crisis in the making. You better call her. And they were right, because I have a large female audience, and I was like, this is an incredibly offensive sounding answer if it's interpreted the wrong way. It wasn't meant that way at all, but it's just how it came out. And that's when you have moments like that where you're like, okay, wait a minute. Yeah, I have to kind of be mindful about this. So yeah, I mean, it's easy to form misconceptions because you fill in the gaps based on what you see about somebody, and you make all these assumptions about what they're like as a person because you're witnessing their public life, but you don't see, their private life at all.
If you could have anyone as a mentor for one day, who would it be?
Probably Trevor Noah or Jon Stewart.
Yeah.
I've always been, it's funny, I was never a hardcore Daily Show fan when Jon Stewart was on, ironically. And I remember thinking Trevor Noah, I was like, this poor guy is going to have the most impossible shoes to fill, but thanks to Donald Trump, he's made a career out of this. I think that, to me, that's the best thing could have ever happened to Trevor Noah, because he has so much material to work with. But no, I mean, I really thought, is this guy going to really step into these shoes and fill it? And it's been impressive to watch. I mean, really, he's kind of taken it to another level. I thought this is going to be impossible. How is he going to fill Jon Stewart's shoes? And he's done an amazing job. And I think what's interesting is he would be a fascinating person to spend a day with, because he's had to overcome a lot of cultural things. He understands what he also understands what it's like to be a minority in the media and have such a massive presence. I think it's interesting because that's one thing that, particularly being back here in College Station, you're not, it makes me aware of the fact that, when we came to College Station in 1986, I remember there were 2 Indian kids the whole school, and it seemed like one was added every year, and then I left. So I think there were 3 total from the graduating class at Bryan High in 1996.
Right. And fortunately, things have changed here. Not that things are perfect here.
Yeah.
I don't want to create a picture that is unrealistic. I mean, there's certainly racial challenges here, as there are anywhere.
Yeah.
But it's much improved.
Yeah.
But I love Trevor Noah. I love the way that he talks about race on his show, and
yeah, it's never he's educational about it. Like he's never coming at it from, I'm a victim of my race,
right.
Which, you've seen what he's been through. Like, if you read his books, he's been through hell to get to where he's at. And so I've always admired everything that he does. I think it's just neat. And I think people who can produce at that level and at that quality day after day, like there's so much to be learned from that. Like, what does that take?
I agree. Well, so you do have a history here of Texas A&M, even though you didn't come to school here. What's your fondest memory of Texas A&M or College Station in general?
So it's so funny you were saying that, because I remember seeing that question. I was trying to think about it. Like, I was like, I had a first date on this campus on which I failed to kiss a girl, which that's not my fondest memory.
Epic fail. No.
Yeah, that was an epic fail. It was right in front of the MSC, actually. And it's funny that I met up with her years later, but I was thinking about it because the hotel I'm at is right across the street from Kyle Field. And, I was never like a giant football fan. But, I attempted to play football in 7th grade and got the hell beat out of me. As anybody knows, there are 7th graders the size of grown men in Texas.
Yes.
But I think, in all honesty, the thing that came to mind when I saw that question was a memory of just walking out onto Kyle Field for the first time and just seeing, 120,000 fans. You're just like, and especially when you're in 7th grade, it's just so big, and you kind of, it's the sense of like pride and pageantry and history. I always say I'm sure one of the reasons Friday Night Lights is probably my favorite TV show is because I grew up here, because it's an accurate depiction of life in a small Texas town. Like, if you've lived in Texas and you watch that show, you're like, that's exactly what it's like to grow up in Texas.
Yeah.
Like, every person who I went to Bryan High with, I can match up a character to that to somebody in that show.
It is a great show for many reasons.
Yeah.
Probably some I don't even understand, like using one camera and all the things that they did to film that show. But you're right. It is an accurate depiction of life in Texas.
When you walk out into Kyle Field for the first time, especially as a 7th grader, and you just hear all that noise and you see all those people, and you're just like, it's like a sensory overload in the best way imaginable. You're kind of like, wow.
Especially a night game. There's just something magical about all of it.
I mean, I've even marched on that field in marching band when I was in high school. So so I would say, I don't know if it's the fondest, but it was the one that came to mind when I saw that question.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
We end each episode with Good Bull. This is an opportunity to recognize someone for something great they have done. Yeah. Is there anyone you would like to send Good Bull?
Well, I mean, funny that we're in Texas of all places. One of my coworkers was asking me the other night, he said, what is the thing that you think was the best thing and worst thing that came from College Station? And I was like, well, it's hot as hell here and the weather sucks in the summer. And I said, the best thing, I said, the schools and the teachers. I said, it should tell you something that I'm 40 years old and I still chose to go and have dinner with my 9th grade biology teacher, after all this time.
It's amazing.
And another teacher was a music teacher that just poured immense amounts of time and energy into me. And I was telling him, I said, you couldn't have picked a better place to send your kids to school because the schools here are amazing. This place is, it's funny because unless you're from here, you have this misperception of what it's like. You watch Friday Night Lights and you think nobody cares about anything but football. But then you come here and you realize that I've never seen so much money put into extracurricular activities and really creating experiences for students. I mean, I remember when I landed in California, the school was terrible in comparison to Bryan High. So I would say the teachers here.
Plug your stuff.
Well, you can find everything I do at Unmistakable Creative. And if you're listening to this and you like podcasts, the Unmistakable Creative is full of really interesting people. Our listeners say if TED Talks met Oprah, you would have the Unmistakable Creative. Oh,
that's I agree with that. That's true. That's a good analogy.
Wow.
And you don't really need us to plug you because you're much more famous than we are, but I still would like to. So I'm very glad that you're here, and thanks for your time today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to stay up to date on our latest videos, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon to receive notifications. If you're in a rush or on the road, you can still join us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. If you want to learn more about us or our guests, please visit our website at mays.tamu.edu/podcasts. Also, please check out Mays Business School's academic programs. They're the sponsors of our show, and you can find them in the description. Thanks, and gig 'em.